Shabbat Shalom. I'm super happy to welcome all the chaplains here. I love your passion and energy about entering into ministry. So I wanted to share a story. Actually, some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not. And it's a story that I think will sit close to home and should be and I believe it's in the DNA of most chaplains who are in service for this country. In the early morning of February 3rd, 1943, the Army transport ship, the Dorchester, was crossing the North Atlantic Ocean, about 100 miles off the coast of Greenland, carrying more than 900 men. And just before 1 a.m. in the morning, a German torpedo hit and tears into her hull. The ship begins to sink in freezing waters in darkness and chaos. I'm sure you can imagine the scene. On board are 4 chaplains: George Fox, a Methodist minister; Clark Bowling of the Reformed Church; John Washington, a Catholic priest; and Alexander Good, a rabbi. In the panic on the deck, the 4 of them moved together among all of the men, calming them, guiding them toward lifeboats, putting life preservers on everybody they could find, gathering them from storage lockers. When their lockers were empty and there was no more life jackets to give out, each of the 4 of the chaplains took off their own life preservers and gave them to somebody else. Survivors in the water looked back at the Dorchester as she went down, and what they saw has not left American imagination or memory, I should say. The 4 chaplains, linked arm in arm, braced against the slanting deck, praying together. Witnesses said they heard Hebrew, Latin, English, 4 voices, 4 traditions, 1 embrace, going down together. Fewer than a third of the men on that ship survived that night. The chaplains, unfortunately, did not survive either. The image of the linked arms did something for this country. In the years after the war, the 4 chaplains became an icon of a new American idea, that the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish faiths could stand together. That this was, in the phrase entered into the time, first time ever really heard, a Judeo-Christian nation. And I want to be honest with you about the phrase, because prior to that, in our history, the history of interfaith movement anyway in the country, I should say, the term Judeo-Christian wasn't even stated. It's not something that was handed down from Sinai. It was largely born in the 1930s and 40s, championed by groups like the National Conference of Christians and Jews as a moral answer to fascism. When Nazi propaganda insisted that Jews stood outside of Western civilization, Americans of goodwill answered saying, no, they don't. They stand well within it. They stand so much in it that they are one of the foundations of Western civilization. That foundation is the Judeo-Christian foundation. And the image of the 4 chaplains, the act of love that they held together linked with their arms, was living proof of that foundation. I don't want us to forget the hyphen. I want us to play with that hyphen, though, a little bit. There are Jews alive today, communities like this one thriving in Middle Georgia, I would say that we are, in part because our Christian neighbors, our friends, have decided that we belong, and they have supported us. That hyphen can protect us, and it also can quietly erase us, because Judeo-Christian can suggest that Judaism and Christianity are basically the same thing. That Judaism is simply the first draft of a faith that became Christianity. The opening act, one might argue, that the Old Testament was simply waiting for the sequel. And friends, that's not friendship, that's absorption. Real friendship, the kind the chaplains practiced on the Dorchester, begins when we allow the other person to be who they are. So I'll share with you something else. Jews and Christians hold the same Hebrew Bible, but we already spoke about that a little bit. If you're looking at the Hebrew Bible, that's one thing, the Septuagint something different. We read through, though, we look at the same text, different hermeneutical lenses. Not because either is careless with the text, not because one of us is dishonest with the text, but because each community reads from different revelatory centers with a different method. And at different times, if you focus deep in the Masoretic text versus the Septuagint, different texts and verses and words. We look at a beginning or starting point. Judaism stands out, and it stands at Sinai. Torah is not a preliminary or preparatory. It is God's eternal covenant, le'olam, forever. As Leviticus and Deuteronomy insist, it is complete. It is sufficient. Everything else in the canon, the prophets, the writings, all of them alike, are all read in relation and understood in connection to Torah, never over and against it. Christianity stands, its revelatory moment, in a different location. It stands at an empty tomb. For the church, the resurrection is the hermeneutical key. What Paul means when he says Christ died and rose in accordance with the scriptures is what Luke dramatized on the MS mispronouncing it, road, forgive me. I'm used to seeing it only in writing. Where the risen Jesus must open the disciples' minds before they can find him in Moses and the prophets. Notice what the scene concedes. The meaning was not visible on the surface of the text. It required a new lens, a new method. Second, we get to the method. How the two different traditions read. Well, Jewish interpretation is layered. There's the Pardes, the Peshat, the Remes, the Drash, and the Sod. In the Peshat, we have the plain contextual verse. We understand, and the Talmud teaches us specifically and says a verse never loses its simplistic understanding. Rashi, in fact, a medieval French commentator who wrote prolifically on every verse in the Bible, based much of what he did on that principle. He asked the question, what did Isaiah mean in his verse in the 8th century Judah speaking to King Ahaz in Isaiah's own Hebrew? We read that it's part of a birth of something better to come, of the king who's yet to arrive, King Hezekiah. By contrast, it's retrospective and typological reading for Christians who read backward from the Christ event so that Adam, the Passover lamb, the manna, the suffering servants become types or foreshadowings, whose full meaning is disclosed only in their fulfillment. That is a coherent, sophisticated method. The church fathers refined it, in fact, into, I would argue, an art, but it moves in the opposite direction. It begins with a conclusion and reads toward the ancient texts so that the ancient texts fit that conclusion. And the third surprising thing that I find sometimes come out of the fact that we even have different words for the same passages. In Judaism, we read the Masoretic Hebrew. The early church later read the Greek Septuagint. And take that famous verse that I mentioned in Isaiah, where the prophet gives King Ahaz a sign, an Alma, a young woman who will conceive and bear a son named Emmanuel. In the Peshat, plain, simple meaning of the text, Isaiah is referring to a frightened king in the 8th century before a child, an heir is born in his own day, grows up, the two enemy kings besiege Jerusalem, will be gone, and everything will be okay. But the Greek translation rendered Alma as Parthenos, virgin. We would understand that as Betula in the Hebrew, by the way. Totally different word. And it is the Greek word Matthew Gospels quote as a prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus. Or take Psalm 22, where our Hebrew reads karai, like the lion at my hands and feet. The Greek reads instead, they pierced my hands and feet, which Christians heard as a crucifixion foretold. A single letter, by the way, the difference in karai, in the Hebrew to the Greek. 2,000 years of theology, by the way, have taken that single letter difference into a chasm, one might argue. And so when we look at the world, our two communities keep different times. Well, Judaism reads the prophets like a checklist forward and finds it unfulfilled. No universal peace, no sword into plowshares, no ingathering complete. Maimonides, medieval rabbi, in Egypt, insists that the Messiah is known not by faith claims, but by verifiable accomplishments. So we are still waiting for that peaceful moment to come when lion and lamb may lie down together, which is why every single Seder we say next year in Jerusalem. Christianity answers that same understanding of the Messiah with already not yet at the same time. The Messianic age inaugurated at the resurrection, awaiting consummation for its second coming, a two-stage Messiah. No, I can argue that there is one Jewish source that anticipates a two-stage, but really that's not in mainstream Judaism. And before Jesus anticipated, which is precisely why the resurrection had to be imagined for our understanding of it. The same texts, two visions, two internally coherent systems of reading, which means the disagreement between us was never really about the verses. It's rather more about the lens. You cannot settle it by proof texting Isaiah 53. We can't sit here and cite verse after verse at each other because each community's theology determines how the text is read. It is not the other way around. The scholar Amy Jo Levine, a Jewish professor of New Testament at Vanderbilt, teaches, which by the way, just a side note, kind of cool that there is a Orthodox rabbi professor of Christian studies. I find that so fascinating. Okay. She focuses and draws a conclusion to ask Jews why we don't accept Jesus is like asking Christians why they don't follow Muhammad. The Torah functions for the synagogue as Jesus functions for the church. And she teaches that honest conversation between us cannot begin with either entitlement or apology, end quote. We must come to the table with humility and interest. Humility and interest, that should be on the doorposts of every single door of interfaith events, not just the mezuzah. And now here's where the calendar, I think, helps me when I was putting together this sermon. Tonight is Shabbat Chazon, the Shabbat of Vision, the Sabbath right before the Jewish holiday of Tisha B'Av, a holiday that mourns the destruction of the temple in the year 70. And I want to notice something remarkable about the catastrophe. It is the shared birthplace, in fact, of both Christian and Jewish faith. When the temple fell, the Judaism of Jesus' own lifetime, the diverse multi-group, 18 different segments of Judaism all arguing and trying to find out what was the best path to be Jewish, the temple-centered aspect of it had to answer an impossible question. How do we go on now? And two answers survived. One gathered at Yavna around Torah, prayer, and study, and became what we have today. It's our legacy, rabbinic Judaism. It's what we practice, what you've been doing this evening. The other gathered in memory of the crucified and risen teacher and became Christianity. Neither of us is simply biblical religion continued. We are siblings, two children of the same crises, the same scripture, the same God who grew up to read the family library differently. And tonight, we begin with the book of Devarim or Deuteronomy. Devarim words in which Moses does something astonishing. He retells the entire story, 40 years of wandering, told again. And if you compare his retelling to Exodus and Numbers, shock of shocks, it doesn't always match up. Moses himself reinterprets his own stories, just like we sometimes will reinterpret our own memories. Our own Torah models it. Sacred tradition lives to be retold, and every retelling stands somewhere. Which brings me back to the four chaplains standing on the sinking ship of the Dorchester. Notice what they did not do. They did not merge into one prayer. Rabbi Good did not try to pray in Latin. Sorry for my Catholic priest friend. Father Washington did not pretend to say the Shema in his liturgy. Each man prayed as he was, fully Jewish, fully Catholic, fully Protestant, and they linked arms regardless. That's the teaching. Their unity was not sameness. Their unity was love, which had room for difference. Love strong enough to give away a life jacket across every line that was supposed to divide them. I encourage you as chaplains, as you leave this room, as you go on into your faith practice, and you will sit with the dying of all faith. You will sit with individuals who have no faith. You will sit with individuals who are at a massive inflection point in their own life. You have learned that you serve people best by not erasing tradition, yours or theirs, but by bringing your whole self to their whole self in that very moment. You are the heirs of the Dorchester. So in this Shabbat of Vision, let this be our vision. Not one flattened Judeo-Christian faith, but two visions honestly held, arm in arm, linked together, where we're all the same underneath, may unfold to a deeper, harder, and holier truth. We are different, and we belong to each other regardless. May the memories of Fox pulling Washington and Good be for a blessing for all of us. May our study together be filled with humility and interest, and may we as Jews and Christians, hosts and guests, go down into every deep water of this life the way that those chaplains did before us, holding one another with love. Shabbat Shalom.